We are quickly closing in on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth being available for about 2 months, and even so, we have more information to go over regarding critical moments of Rebirth, and perhaps more excitingly, details pertaining to the development of Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. Because we'll be talking about a mixture of Rebirth and Part 3 content, I've decided to start the video talking about everything we've learned about the development of Part 3, along with previous bits of confirmed information developers have stated about it, before going into some Rebirth content towards the end, as all of it pertains to ending spoilers. Before we jump right in, consider participating in my giveaways of Stellar Blade and Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance if you are interested in these 2 games and want to test your luck at winning these games for free, paid for by yours truly. Details regarding the giveaways are linked in the description. The anticipation for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 is palpable, especially after how well Rebirth was received from both fans and critics alike, and also due to the game's enigmatic conclusion. Thanks to the recent release of the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth Ultimania, a massive book detailing much of the development of the game and the game's narrative, this, for now, Japan-only book sheds some light on details pertaining to Part 3. And massive thanks to Audrey at Itaikimochi for her translations on Twitter to keep all of us not in Japan in the know of the development of the remake series. First up, let's dive right into Part 3, shall we? According to the Rebirth Ultimania, Rebirth director Naoki Hamaguchi stated that Part 3 should adhere to much of the original PS1 game in terms of events and locations, including places like the Icicle Inn and the Northern Crater, along with key events like the awakening of the weapons, etc. He also mentions that flying around in the Highwind is of utmost importance here in Part 3, which he also previously stated in his interview with Gene Park of the Washington Post when he wanted to really nail the Highwind's implementation in Part 3. At the moment, Hamaguchi-san is contending with exactly how to represent the freedom of flying around in a massive airship across the world, with a game that contains such high graphical detail. Definitely going to be interesting to see how they pull off the Highwind traversal, but if it's anything like how we see the brief moments with the tiny Bronco play out in Rebirth, it should be fine, albeit we will be in full control of the Highwind in Part 3, and not limited to on-rail sequences perhaps. Hamaguchi-san also intends to introduce something new and surprising to the experience of Part 3, much like how he states Part 1 and Part 2 did. Nailing the Highwind traversal is key for Part 3, as that was such a key part of the original. Seeing as Part 3 is remaking Disc 2 and Disc 3 of the original, the Highwind was introduced pretty early on in Disc 2, but of course, the events on how things will ultimately transpire are completely unknown to us fans at this point with Part 3. What we do know is that in addition to the aforementioned Icicle Inn in Northern Crater that Hamaguchi-san discussed, he also discussed with IGN that the team plans to include Rocket Town, further fleshing out Sid Highwind, who will be making his combat debut in Part 3, along with Vincent Valentine. Also worth mentioning is Square's increased importance on Wutai in Part 3, as they very much are planning to incorporate the country of Wutai into Part 3, as the events of Rebirth ignited a war between Wutai and Shinra. Seeing the once optional area in the OG game get greater importance in Part 3 is going to be awesome to see. Now, if you are wondering how far into development Part 3 is in, according to Rebirth Ultimania, the main story for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 has been completed, and creative director Tetsuya Nomura thinks that they will perhaps start voice recording in the near future. Definitely excellent news to hear that the main scenario has been completed, and it's not hard to believe this, since back in the summer of 2022, Nomura stated that work on Part 3 had begun. Later on in Audrey's post, she mentions, quote, "Kitase hopes to deliver an amazing product for Part 3 without having to sacrifice quality over time." He says the reason why Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was such an efficient development period was because they retained the same staff as the previous installment, and Part 3 will also have the same team. Yoshinori Kitase, the producer of the remake trilogy, echoed these statements in his interview with Gene Park of the Washington Post earlier this year, when Kitase-san said that 80 to 90% of the staff who worked on Final Fantasy VII Remake stayed on to work on Rebirth, and with this representing the same situation for Part 3, we can expect the game to release as efficiently and as quickly as Rebirth did. Not having to train new staff and get an entire team up to speed with new systems for game development is a critical factor as to how Rebirth, for as large and ambitious as it is over Final Fantasy VII Remake, was able to be completed so quickly. In fact, Audrey continues in her post, stating that Kitase-san mentions that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was actually completed within 3 years, since 1 year was for the development of Yuffie's intermission DLC for Remake Intergrade. Kitase-san hopes to be able to stick to Rebirth's speedy schedule for Part 3, so those looking forward to Part 3 to release in time for Final Fantasy VII's 30th anniversary in 2027 may just get their wishes granted here. In this same post, Audrey writes a very interesting passage here outlining something that Kitase-san wants to include in Part 3 that wasn't in the original game, stating that Nomura-san is pondering how to deliver that something. Kitase-san believes that if they can deliver this thing well, that fans will be happy. Write to me in the comments what you think this something is, but my guess is that it has to do with moments with certain characters. Just keeping it as spoiler-free as I can before we get into spoilers later on. Making fans happy is something that producer Kitase-san is seemingly trying to get across with Part 3, as Audrey claims that Kitase, quote, wants to finish the trilogy on a positive note without leaving behind unfinished business. She remarks that that's just Kitase's own personal opinion on the matter, but he also addresses that he wants to bring the trilogy to a close with the hopes that Cloud and crew will be happy at the end. Amidst all the confusion and fan theories about remakes and Rebirth's endings, let's hope that this all gets resolved efficiently in Part 3. Audrey addresses that the book also mentions that Kitase-san hopes that the world of Final Fantasy VII lives on after the conclusion of the FF7 Remake trilogy, so perhaps we'll see more entries in the FF7 series after this remake project is over. Definitely makes sense to me, as FF7 is Square's cash cow, so I'm sure we'll see more from this universe years after the remake trilogy has concluded. Definitely let me know your thoughts on that. Would you like to see more expansions to the compilation of Final Fantasy VII in the future? I'll just say, sign me up, so long as they handle the projects with love and care that reflect the quality of these recent remakes and the original game, and not just sloppily put together games for the sake of making money. Finally, Ultimania reveals that Kitase-san believes that this will be his final involvement with the Final Fantasy VII series due to his age, and that bringing a happy conclusion to the series would make both himself and fans happy with the legacy of these Final Fantasy VII projects. So that's a summary of all the tidbits we got from the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth Ultimania pertaining to Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, so rest assured, the team is hard at work to complete it in time for FF7's 30th anniversary. We learned from Tetsuya Nomura in the previous video that he is hungry to finish the remake trilogy, and that the team is full steam ahead on the third game, and that legendary Final Fantasy soundtrack producer Nobuo Uematsu has agreed to compose some tracks for Part 3. But now, we shift our attention to the final part of this video, diving into some heavy spoilers for Rebirth, as the Rebirth Ultimania outlines some key areas pertaining to the game's ending that the developers want us to reflect on as we await Part 3. From here on out, spoilers ahead for Rebirth. One of the most interesting parts of Audrey's Twitter posts surrounding the Ultimania revolve Aerith's fate at the end of the game. Perhaps most hilariously, even the developers state that they don't know. I mean, of course they do, but they sure as hell aren't going to tell us that now. Here is what Audrey outlines the Ultimania discusses about Aerith's fate in Rebirth. Quote, "It is hard to tell whether she lives or dies. Based on what we see, it can lead to different interpretations. However, what is confirmed is the party sees something completely different than Cloud. The party fights Jenova with full limit breaks because of anger, except for Cloud, and Barrett even says that this is a battle of mourning for her. There is a scene where Cloud is holding Aerith and speaking something, but it's drowned out by the noise, so we do not know what they said. After the fight at Forgotten Capital, Aerith appears next to Cloud, but Tifa cannot see her. The party seems to be sitting at the edge of a lake where Aerith should have been laid to rest in from the original game. It is unknown how and where Aerith came from to aid Cloud in the last fight against Sephiroth. Is the last Aerith at the ending actually alive? Or is she from the lifestream? Or is she just a hallucination made by Cloud? At the moment, we do not know. The world where Zack is alive, or the world where Aerith and Cloud appeared in the Sector 5 slums, has a crack in the sky. Does this signify the end of the world, or...? So Square is definitely giving us just some food for thought here, and is revealing nothing in regards to Aerith's fate in Rebirth. That said, It is fun to hear the developers try to encourage fans to question parts of the ending, as we ultimately make sense of it all in 3 years when Part 3 releases. It's worth mentioning the rather interesting find that Subtext over on Twitter found regarding the ending credits that have seemingly omitted the scenes where Cloud and Aerith are interacting with each other, as this omission in the credits has left some wondering what this intentional act may imply for the story and what exactly happened to Aerith. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comments, and definitely consider watching this video going over what the world map may look like in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, as Part 3 is going to be incredibly big, even larger than Rebirth. Thank you all for your awesome support, and I look forward to seeing all you good people real soon in the next one.